Hey guys, tonight we're going to sit with a woman who wrote 9 books about her own childhood and left one of her family out of every single one of them. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. He was born on the 1st of November, 1875, and everybody called him Freddie. He was Laura's baby brother. He lived 9.5 months. And if you have read the Little House books, all 8 of them, front to back, more than once, the way most people listening tonight have, then you have never met him. He is not in a chapter. He is not in a sentence. He is not in a line. She did write him down. Once. In 1930, when she was 63 years old, Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down with a soft pencil and a stack of cheap school tablets and wrote out the true story of her life. Freddie is in it. Then she took that manuscript and turned it into books for children, and he came out. That is what we're doing tonight. Not the books. What went into them, and what didn't, and why an old woman in Missouri decided which was which. If these quiet histories slow your mind down at night, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what the clock says there. Our 3 little books live at prairiesecrets.com. On a television, scan the QR code on your screen. On a phone, the links are in the description and the pinned comments. And if you drift off somewhere in the middle of this, good. That is exactly what it is for. I'll keep watch. So, Freddie. He was born in the autumn of 1875, when Laura was 8 years old and the family was in Minnesota. The sources disagree about the exact spot. Some say Walnut Grove, some say South Troy. What they agree on is the season and the year, and the fact that Carolyn Ingalls, who had already buried nobody at that point, now had 4 children instead of 3, and one of them was a boy. That mattered more than we might think from here. Charles Ingalls had 3 daughters and a farm that kept failing. A son was Hans. A son was the arithmetic of the next 20 years. Freddie was 9 months old the following August. The family had given up on Minnesota by then, and they were travelling east, which is the direction the books never go. They stopped in South Troy with Charles's brother Peter and his wife Eliza, and there, on the 27th of August, 1876, the baby died. The record gives the cause as diarrhea. In 1876, that word covered a great deal of ground, and the underlying cause was never established. What it meant in practice was that a 9-month-old child got sick in the heat and stayed sick and did not get better. Here is the sentence Laura wrote about it, 54 years later, in pencil. Little brother got worse instead of better, and one awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead. Read that again slowly. That is not a woman reaching for an effect. That is a woman who was 9 years old in the room, remembering exactly what a body does. He was buried on Peter Ingalls' farm. The grave was not marked. Nobody has found it since. I want to be careful about what that means, because it is easy to hear it as neglect, and it almost certainly was not. A family travelling with everything they own, in August, in a wagon, with a dead infant, does not have a stonecutter, and does not have $40, and is not going to stay. What they have is a brother with a farm and a corner of it that will not be ploughed. So the child goes in the ground with the people who are there, and somebody remembers the spot, and the people who remember the spot die. That is how most children were buried in that country. It is only strange to us because we expect a marker. But it does mean something particular for this story. Charles Frederick Ingalls has no grave you can visit, no stone with his name cut into it, and no chapter. The only place he exists at all is in 400 pages of pencil that nobody would publish for 84 years. She is his headstone. That is the whole of it. Now hold both of those things at once. She remembered it that clearly, and she wrote it down that plainly, and then she built 8 books out of the same childhood, and she left him where he lay. The books have a shape. Pa, Ma, Mary, Laura, Carrie, and later Grace. A father and a house full of women. That shape is the one the whole world knows, and it is the shape you get when you take a 9-month-old boy out of the middle of it. Most accounts hurry past this. We're not going to. Because once you notice Freddie, you start noticing the pattern he belongs to, and the pattern turns out to run through the entire series, from the first page of the first book to the last page of the last. Let's start with that first page, because it's stranger than it looks. Little House in the Big Woods opens like this. Once upon a time, 60 years ago, a little girl lived in the big woods of Wisconsin, in a little grey house made of logs. 60 years ago. The book came out in April of 1932. 60 years before that is 1872. She's telling you the date in the first line, if you care to do the arithmetic, and almost nobody ever has. The book also tells you how old she is, though not with a number. There is a birthday. Pa gives her the birthday spanks, and the counting goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the book explains it plainly. 1 spank for each year, and at the last one big spank to grow on. Then Ma gives her 5 little cakes, 1 for each year that Laura had lived with her and Pa. 5 little cakes. That is the sort of detail nobody invents and nobody misremembers. A mother in a log house with almost nothing made 5 small cakes and set them down in front of a child, and 58 years later the child could still count them. 5 years old, turning 5. Laura Ingalls was born on the 7th of February 1867, so she turned 5 on the 7th of February 1872. 1872, the same year the first line gives you. So far the book is telling the truth precisely, twice. And here's where it gets interesting. Land records show the Ingalls family lived near Pepin, Wisconsin, not once, but twice. The first time, Charles and his brother-in-law Henry Quiner bought 160 acres in the autumn of 1863 for $335. They sold it in May of 1868 to a man named Gustav Gustafsson for about $1,000. Laura was 1 year old when they left. Then they came back. The second Wisconsin stay runs from 1871 to the autumn of 1873, when Charles sold the place again, this time to Andrew Anderson for $1,000. The little grey house in the big woods, the one with the birthday cakes and the 5-year-old girl, is the second stay, 1871 to 1873. The book is accurate about that, which means the family had already been somewhere else. 2 somewhere elses, in fact. And the second of them is the one the second book is about. Little House on the Prairie is book 2, Kansas. The wagon, the creek crossing, the cabin Pa builds with his own hands, the well, the fever, the wolves, the neighbours, the ending where they hitch up and drive away. Every person listening to this can see that book in their head. It happened before the big woods, not after. Before. The family was in Montgomery County, Kansas, by February of 1870, and possibly from the autumn of 1869. They were gone by the spring of 1871, and Charles was back in Wisconsin by late May of that year, because that's when he signed a document there. So the true order is Kansas, then Wisconsin. The published order is Wisconsin, then Kansas. Book 1 happens after Book 2. Caroline Fraser, who wrote the biography that won the Pulitzer Prize for this family, states it flatly. The events in the first volume occurred after those in the second, and there's a second consequence, which is bigger. The books move west. That is their engine and their whole feeling. Every volume the wagon points at the horizon, and the family follows it, further out, further on, into more space. That movement is the reason the books feel the way they feel. The real family moved east twice, Kansas back to Wisconsin in 1871, and Minnesota back to Iowa in 1876, the trip Freddie died on. 2 retreats, both erased, and the story that's left runs one direction only. Now, the ages. The family reached Kansas in early 1870 and left in the spring of 1871, which means that for the whole of Little House on the Prairie, Laura was somewhere between 2 years and 7 months old and 4 years and 1 month old. 2, 3, 4. She was 3 years old when Carrie was born there, on the 3rd of August, 1870. The girl in that book notices everything. She watches her father lay the logs. She watches the Osage ride past the door. She listens to the wolves circle the house all night, and she remembers what the lamplight did. That is not a 3-year-old. That is a child of 6 or 7, which is roughly the age the book quietly lets you assume. So the obvious question is whether she simply got it wrong. 60 years is a long time. Memory silts up. People misplace their own childhoods all the time. She did not get it wrong. In the manuscript she wrote in 1930 describing the journey back out of Kansas, she says the family had to wait in northern Missouri for high water to go down, and she describes herself in that moment as 4 years old. 4 years old. Which puts that halt at almost exactly February of 1871, her 4th birthday. Her own handwriting has the arithmetic right. She knew how old she was. When the age changed, it changed later, and on purpose. Let that sit for a second, because it reframes the whole thing. We're not looking at an old woman misremembering. We're looking at a writer making decisions. While we're in Missouri, there's something else standing there, and it's the largest single hole in the entire record. On the 28th of May, 1868, Charles and Caroline Ingalls bought 80 acres in Chariton County, Missouri, for $900. They bought it sight unseen from Wisconsin, from 2 men named Adamantine Johnson and Robert Cable. By the 26th of August, 1869, they were living on it, because that's the day they both stood in front of a clerk in Ketersville and signed a power of attorney. They never made a payment. On the 25th of February, 1870, they appeared before a justice of the peace in Kansas and handed the land back. That's a 1.5 years of a family's life, a purchase, a move, a farm, a failure, and a walk away from $900. Laura Ingalls. Wilder never wrote about it. Not in the novels, which we might expect. Not in the memoir, which we might not. Not in any surviving letter. Missouri is not softened or moved or renamed. It is simply gone. And notice where it is gone from, because that is the part that matters. Everything else we're going to talk about tonight follows one pattern. It happened, she wrote it down in private in 1930, and she kept it out of the books. That is a decision about what children should read. Missouri is different. Missouri is not in the books, and it is not in the private manuscript either. She sat alone in a stone house at 63 with a pencil, and nobody watching and nothing to lose. She wrote out the drunk man at her bed, and the schoolmaster, and the wagon in the dark. She did not write one word about the 1.5 years her family spent in Chariton County. There are 2 honest explanations, and I cannot choose between them for you. One is that she genuinely did not remember it. She was 1 and 2 years old. That is fair, and it is probably most of the answer. The other is that she had never been told. $900 promised and never paid, handed back in front of a justice of the peace in another state. That is the kind of thing a family stops mentioning, and then stops thinking about, and then does not have. Either way, the effect is the same. There is a hole in the middle of her childhood that she could not have filled if she had wanted to, and she did not know it was there. And there's a reason the Kansas years needed careful handling too, though it isn't the reason the book gives. The claim was in Rutland Township, Montgomery County, Kansas. Section 36, Township 33, Range 14, in the southeast corner. That is a precise place. You can stand on it. It was also, at the time, Osage land. The Osage Diminished Reserve covered 4.8 million acres, and the Treaty of 1865 specifically barred the preemption and homestead laws from applying to it. There was no legal way for a white family to file on that ground in 1870. Charles Ingalls did not file. He could not have. He built a house on land that belonged to somebody else and waited to see what happened. Carolyn Fraser puts it in one sentence. The family's iconic Kansas house was illegally built on land belonging to the Osage. It gets narrower still. The specific tract was a school section, set aside for the state, which the state would later sell at a minimum of $3 an acre. Even when the reserve did open, That particular quarter was never going to be free, none of which is a scandal exactly. Thousands of families did the same thing, betting that the government would eventually legalise what they had already done. It is simply not the situation the book describes. In the book, the land is empty, and the government is a rumour somewhere far off. In the record, the land has owners and a price and a date. The dates are worth having because they explain the ending. The 27th of May, 1868. A treaty is signed to sell the reserve to a railroad at something between 19 and 25 cents an acre. It is never ratified, and it is withdrawn at the end of 1869, the 15th of July, 1870. Congress passes an act authorising the removal of the Osage and opening the reserve to settlers at $1.25 an acre. The 9th and 10th of September, 1870. At a council on Drum Creek, the Osage agree to go. 160 acres per person in Indian Territory and $50,000 toward the cost of moving. That autumn, most of the tribe leaves for the hunt and does not come back. The women, the children and the old people winter at Silver Lake down in Indian Territory. The main body returns briefly in March of 1871 and then goes for good. They went past the Ingalls house. That is not a literary flourish, it's geography. The road out ran by the claim. Stay with that for a moment, because it is the true version of one of the most famous passages she ever wrote. In the book, there is a long line of Osage riders going by, and Laura watches from the door, and one of them has a baby with black eyes, and she wants it, and she cries when they're gone. It is a scene readers remember for the rest of their lives. In the book, it is a mystery and a wonder, and it happens for no stated reason. In the record, it has a reason, and the reason has a date on it and a dollar amount. 160 acres each, in Indian Territory, and $50,000 toward the cost of the wagons. The people going past that door were not passing through. They were being moved, by agreement, under pressure, off land they had been guaranteed, so that families exactly like the one in the doorway could buy it for $1.25 an acre. The women and children and the old people spent that winter at Silver Lake down in Indian Territory. The main body came back briefly in March and then went for good, and Laura Ingalls, who was 3, watched some of it from the front of a house that was standing on their ground. She did not know any of that at 3 years old. She knew all of it at 63, and she wrote the scene from the doorway anyway, and I think she was right to. The child's version is truer to what a child saw. It is only not the whole of what happened, and in the spring of 1871 the reserve is surveyed, and from June of that year a settler could get title. Now. The book ends because soldiers are coming to remove the white settlers. Pa hears it, and he will not wait to be moved, so the family loads the wagon and leaves on their own terms. It's a proud ending, and it's the emotional logic of the whole volume. The historical work on this has turned up exactly one relevant notice. In August of 1870, an army captain named Poland issued a warning to intruders. It was aimed at people squatting in Indian Territory, south in what is now Oklahoma, not at settlers in Kansas. It circulated in Montgomery County, and it may well have caused honest confusion. The likelier reason is duller and much sadder. The land was about to cost $1.25 an acre, and Charles Ingalls did not have it. He had just walked away from a Missouri farm without paying for it, and word had come that Gustav Gustafson, the man who had bought the Wisconsin place, had defaulted, which meant the old farm in the big woods was theirs again, standing empty, already paid for. Moving back made more financial sense than trying to borrow the price of the claim. So they went east. That's the substitution. She took a debt and put a threat in its place. She took a retreat and made it departure. The family that leaves Kansas in the book leaves with its chin up. The family that left Kansas in life left because the bill was coming due. Before we leave that cabin, though, there are a few things standing in it that deserve a minute of their own. Because the Kansas book is not a book she falsified. It's a book she pruned, and the prunings tell you as much as the tree. Start with the doctor. In the book, the whole family goes down with what they call fever and ague. All 4 of them at once, too weak to fetch water. And a black doctor comes to the door and saves their lives. Children have been asking about that man for 90 years, and for most of that time the answer was that he was probably invented. He was not. His name was George A. Tann. He came from a free black family in Pennsylvania, out near White Marsh in Montgomery County, not far from Philadelphia. The record puts his birth on the 27th of November, 1835, though his gravestone says 1825 and the two have never been reconciled. He homesteaded in Kansas less than a mile north of the Ingalls claim, less than a mile. He was not a passing stranger who happened along the road. He was the neighbour. What the family had was almost certainly malaria. It came off the standing water, and it came in waves, and it flattened whole households at a time. Tann treated them through it. There is one more thing he may have done, and I'll give it to you with a hedge attached because only one source carries it. Carrie Ingalls was born on that claim on the 3rd of August, 1870. It appears that Dr. Tann delivered her. He practiced in that country until he retired in 1902, and he died in 1909 of a heart attack after a horse and buggy accident. He is buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Independence, Kansas, in a good plot, in the main ground, not in the section the town set aside for black burials. In the novel, he is Dr. Tann, with one letter gone, and he is on the page for a few minutes, and then he is not. The memoir gives him more. A real man, a mile up the road, who kept 4 people alive and then went home. Then there's Mr. Edwards. He is the best-loved minor character in the whole series. The wildcat from Tennessee, who helps Pa raise the walls, who wades a flooded creek at Christmas so 2 little girls will have tin cups and peppermint sticks, who turns up again years later in Dakota with money in his pocket for Mary. Nobody has ever found him. There's a candidate, a man named Edmund Mason, an English immigrant, enumerated near the Ingalls family in the 1870 census of Montgomery County, and written down as Edward Mason on some records. It's a tempting fit until you remember he had only just come over from England, and Wild as Edwards is a Tennessee man to the bone. What the manuscripts show is a character assembling himself across drafts. In one, an unnamed neighbour helps build the cabin. In later ones, Mr. Edwards brings the Christmas presents, and in the memoir she wrote in 1930, the Christmas gifts in Indian Territory are brought by a man called Mr. Brown, and the money that comes for Mary and Dakota Territory comes from somebody named Uncle Hiram Forbes. 2 different people in 2 different states, 12 years apart. She took them both and made one man, and gave him a state to come from, and a way of talking, and he walked into the books and stayed. That's not a cover-up. That's a novelist doing what novelists do. But it does mean that the character generations of readers have loved best is the one with the least evidence behind him, and I would gently suggest that this is not an accident either. Look at what Mr. Edwards is for in the machinery of the books. Every time the family is at its lowest, he arrives. He turns up at the cabin when there is more work than 2 hands can do. He wades a river in December so that Christmas happens. He appears in Dakota years later with money for a blind girl's schooling, and then goes off again without being thanked properly. He is help, arriving unasked from outside the family. Now think about what we have already established about how these books are built. The family holds, the father provides, the door stays shut. That is the world she made. But a real family cannot hold entirely alone, and she knew that better than anybody, because in 1930 she had written down exactly how her own family had been helped. 2 half-barrels of state flour, a hotel keeper who gave her father work, a couple who offered to take a daughter off their hands. None of that is in the books, because it is help arriving in the form of somebody else's charity, and that is a failure of the shield. So instead there is Mr. Edwards, the same function, made lovable, a friend rather than a charity, help you can accept without losing anything. I cannot prove she did that consciously. What I can say is that the composite character she built out of 2 real strangers does a job in those books that the true version of the same events could not have done. There's a smaller thing too, and it's almost funny. The book says the nearest town is 40 miles away. The claim sits about 13 miles from Independence. The working theory among the people who have measured it is that a small child heard 14 and remembered 40, and nobody ever checked. 40 miles makes the prairie enormous. 13 miles makes it a long day with a wagon, and one more, which I'm planting here on purpose because we'll want it later. When the family drove out of Kansas in the spring of 1871, they traded away the horses, and they traded away the dog, Jack, the brindle bulldog. He went with the horses somewhere around the departure when Laura was about 4. Hold on to that. We'll come back for it. I want to be careful here, because there's a cheap version of all this, and I don't want it. The cheap version says she lied. She didn't. What she did is more interesting than that, and by the end of tonight I think you'll agree. Look at how she treated the big woods, for instance. She wrote that there were no houses and no roads and no people. It's one of the most quoted passages she ever wrote, and it does an enormous amount of work. It puts one small family alone inside a very large silence. The census of 1870 counted almost 200 families in Rock Elm Township, a few miles north. 200 families, not empty at all, full of neighbours and roads to reach them by. Again, though, she's writing about what a 5-year-old could see from the door of one log house. From there, it was empty. The exaggeration is a child's eye exaggeration, and she chose to keep the child's eye and let the census go. And then, near the end of her life, she did something that complicates every accusation anyone has ever made about her. In the 1935 text of Little House on the Prairie, there's a line about the country stretching further than a man could see, and there were no people. Only Indians lived there. In October of 1952, the mother of a 7-year-old wrote to her about it. Wilder was 85. She wrote back to her editor at Harper, Ursula Nordstrom, and here is what she said. You're perfectly right about the fault in Little House on the Prairie and have my permission to make the correction you suggest. It was a stupid blunder of mine. Of course, Indians are people, and I did not intend to imply they were not. The line was changed. No people became no settlers in the next printing. She was 85 years old, she had sold millions of books, and a stranger told her she'd got something wrong, and she agreed at once and fixed it. So we are not dealing with a woman defending a version. We're dealing with a woman who edited her own childhood carefully, deliberately, and for reasons, and who would correct a line when she thought the reason had run out. Which leaves us the real question, and it's the one that runs through the rest of tonight. She kept Freddie out. She kept Missouri out. She turned a debt into soldiers and a retreat into an adventure. She moved her own age up by 2 or 3 years and knew she was doing it. Everything she took out has one thing in common, and once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. But the next stretch of her life is where it stops being tidy. Because between 1874 and 1879 in Minnesota and in Iowa, things happened to the Ingalls family that don't appear in any book at all. Not softened, not moved, not renamed. 5 years and not 1 page. The lamp gets carried into the next room and we'll pick it up there. In the spring of 1874, Charles Ingalls took a piece of ground on Plum Creek in Redwood County, Minnesota, and for the first time in his life he did everything the right way round. The preemption affidavit gives his settlement date as the 24th of May. He filed the claim on the 26th of June. The land was the northwest quarter of Section 18, Township 109, Range 38, and it came to 172 acres. Because it lay inside the railroad zone, the price was $2.50 an acre, instead of the usual $1.25. Do that arithmetic, and you get about $430. Remember that figure? It comes back. They lived in the dugout first. That part is in the book, and it is exactly right. A hole cut back into the bank above Plum Creek, roofed with sod, with a willow bough door and a window at the front and grass growing over the top of it, so the cattle walked across the ceiling. Then he built a house 20 feet by 24, 10 feet to the eaves, with 3 windows in it, 2 stables. He broke 40 acres. In June of 1875 he filed a tree claim as well, on a quarter of Section 4, 3 windows. That detail is worth stopping on. Glass had to come by rail and then by wagon, and it broke. and a man who puts 3 windows into a prairie house is not a man passing through. He is announcing something. That is a man committing. No squatting, no waiting to see, no walking away from a Missouri deed. Land office, filing fee, papers, glass in the windows. The Locusts came on the 15th of July, 1874, 3 weeks after he filed. Everyone who grew up on these books knows the Grasshopper chapters, and they are among the best things she ever wrote. What the books give you is 1 season. What the record gives you is 3. The crop went in 1874. The crop went in 1875. Eggs hatched again in the spring of 1876, and they were still in the country through June of that year. 3 summers. A man with 40 acres broken and glass in his windows watching it go 3 times. There is a difference between 1 bad year and 3, and it is not a difference of degree. 1 bad year is weather. You borrow, you eat less, you plant again, and the thing that carries you through is the reasonable belief that next spring will be ordinary. By the 3rd year that belief is gone. You're not planting against the weather anymore. You're planting against something that has learned where you live. And the eggs were the worst part, because you could see them. They were in the ground you had broken. A man could stand on his own 40 acres in March, knowing exactly what was under his boots, and put seed in anyway, because the alternative was to admit it was finished. He put seed in 3 times, and on the 30th of November, 1875, Charles Ingalls signed his name to a sworn statement that he was, in his own spelling, wholly without means. He signed it to get relief. Minnesota was handing out flour to families the Locusts had ruined, and to receive it a man had to swear he had nothing. He swore it. He received 2 half barrels of flour. They were valued at $5.25. $5.25. That is the number I want you to hold on to tonight, because we're going to set another number beside it before we're finished. For scale, the entire sum Minnesota appropriated for locust relief that year was $20,000 for the whole state. I want to slow down here, because the paper matters more than the flour. To get relief, a man did not simply ask, he signed. He put his name under a statement of his own condition and swore it in front of somebody who wrote it into a book, and then that book went into a state office, and it is still there. Wholly without means. Spelled the way he spelled it. That is a farmer with 3 windows in his house, 40 acres broken and a tree claim filed, writing down in the last week of November that he has nothing so that his wife can bake. Nothing in his own hand. And it is the single hardest thing for a certain kind of man to do, then or now. By then he had already sold the horses. That is not a small line either. The horses are how you plant, how you haul, how you get out, and how you go for a doctor. Selling the team is the moment a farm stops being a farm and becomes a house on some ground. And the girls had stopped going to school for a stretch because they did not have warm enough clothes to walk therein. Think about that from Caroline Ingalls' side of it. She had been a school teacher. Keeping the children in school was the one thing she never negotiated on in the whole of her life, and that winter she could not do it, because there were no coats, now. In 1937, at a book fair in Detroit, Laura Ingalls Wilder stood in front of an audience. She told them, among other things, that her father never accepted public assistance and never left a debt unpaid. Both halves of that sentence are untrue, and we can prove both, and the second one we're going to prove tonight with a wagon in the dark. I don't say that to catch her out. I say it because it tells you exactly what she thought was at stake. She was not protecting a plot. She was protecting a man. The Plum Creek farm ended the way the others did. On the 7th of July, 1876, Charles paid out his preemption, $430.18, handed over to make the land properly his. On the 10th of July, 3 days later, he sold it to a man named Abraham Keller for $400. 3 days. He bought his own farm outright and then sold it at a loss of about $30, and by the end of that summer, the family was on the road east. Which brings us back to the baby. Freddie was 9 months old that August. They stopped in South Troy with Charles's brother Peter and Peter's wife Eliza, and the child got sick, and on the 27th of August, 1876, he died. I gave you Laura's sentence about it earlier. Here it is again, because it belongs here, in its place in the year, and not in an introduction. Little brother got worse instead of better, and one awful day he straightened out his little body and was dead. 9 years old, standing in her uncle's house in Minnesota, with everything the family owned in a wagon outside, watching her brother die. Consider the summer that led to it, because the two things belong together and almost nobody puts them together. In July, Charles Ingalls paid out $430 for a farm and then sold it for $400, and everything the family had was in a wagon. In August, his son died on the road. In neither case was there anything to be done, and in both cases he had been the one who decided where they would be. Whatever a man feels driving away from that, he felt it, and there is no record of it whatsoever. Not a letter, not a line in the memoir, nothing. They buried the baby on the farm, no stone, and then they got back in the wagon and kept going east, because there was nowhere else to go. They stopped in Burr Oak, Iowa. Burr Oak is a small town in the northeast corner of the state, up near the Minnesota line, and by the autumn of 1876 it had a hotel called the Burr Oak House. A man named William Masters had sold it that year to William Stedman, and Stedman needed help running it, and he hired Charles Ingalls. So the family moved into the hotel. Not a house near the hotel. The hotel. It was built into a hillside, so you came in one floor at the front and another at the back, and they lived in it while it operated. Caroline cooked. Mary and Laura, aged 11 and 9, waited on the guests. Next door there was a saloon. That is the sentence Charles and Caroline Ingalls had to live with. Their daughters were carrying plates in a public house with a saloon sharing a wall. And the walls still had holes in them. The previous owner's son had at some point fired a pistol at his wife inside that building, and the bullet holes were still there when the Ingalls girls moved in. Laura wrote that down. She was in a room where a man had shot at his wife, and she could see where the shots went, and she was 9 years old. There is more from that year, and I'll tell you plainly that it is not gentle. One night Charles was called out because a man named Cameron was dragging his wife around a room by her hair. He was holding a lamp while he did it, and the kerosene had spilled and caught, and the fire was running over his hand. Another man died after lighting a cigar. The story as the town told it, and as Laura wrote it, was that he had drunk so much that the flame went down into the fumes in his lungs. Whether that is medically what happened, I could not tell you. What matters is that it is what a 9-year-old girl was told had happened to a man she had seen. The school, at least, was good. Mary and Laura went to a schoolmaster in Burr Oak named Mr. Reed, and Laura remembered him warmly. Whatever else that year was, somebody in it was teaching her properly. But there was another schoolteacher in those years, and here's the reason I have been careful about how I've told all of this. His name was Samuel O. Masters. He was born in 1822. He would eventually file a homestead in Dakota Territory in 1883, and he died in Smet in 1893, and somewhere in between the Ingalls girl sat in his classroom. Laura described him as tall and thin, with bad teeth and bad breath, and she wrote down that he had a habit of taking hold of the girl's hands and not letting go. She wrote that in 1930 in pencil, at the age of 63, about a man who had been dead 37 years. She had carried it that long, and when she finally set it down, she set it down in a manuscript no publisher would buy. Keep the name. We will need it again in about half an hour in a different state, in the worst winter of her life. None of what I have just told you is in any of the 8 books, not one line of it. There was one more thing that happened in Burr Oak, and it is the sort of detail that stops you. A couple in that town, people with money, offered to adopt Laura. Caroline said no. Think about what that offer means. It means the state of the Ingalls family was visible from outside. It means somebody looked at those 4 children and that hotel and that saloon and made a calculation and decided one of the girls could be lifted out of it. And it means Caroline Ingalls, with a dead baby a few months behind her, and nothing in the world said, no thank you. On the 23rd of May, 1877, Grace Pearl Ingalls was born in Burr Oak. the youngest of the sisters, the baby of the family. Readers meet her in the 5th book as a small child who is simply there, the way small children in books sometimes simply are. Her birth is not in any novel because the town she was born in is not in any novel. There was a fire in the saloon next door at some point that year, and that was the end of the hotel for the Ingalls family. They moved out and took rooms above the grocery store. Then they rented a small house in the wooded part of town, and Charles left the hotel work and went to the feed mill. 3 addresses in 1 year, in a town of a few hundred people. The building is still there, by the way. That is the strange thing about Burr Oak. The frame hotel dates from 1856, on a site that had a log hotel on it from 1851. It stopped taking guests in 1878, a year after the Ingallses left. In 1973, a local group bought it, and in 1983 it went on the National Register of Historic Places. It is the only building anywhere in Burr Oak that the Ingalls family is known to have lived in, and it is standing and you can walk into the room. 9 million children have read about the little house in the big woods, which is gone. Almost nobody has stood in the hotel, which is not. And then the bills caught up with them. Doctor's bills from the sickness, grocery bills, and rent, owed to a man named Benjamin Bisbee. Charles went to Bisbee and asked for time. He said he would send the money on. Bisbee refused and told him that if he didn't pay he would take the horses. Charles sold the cow, and here is what Laura wrote about the night that followed. Sometime in the night we children were waked to find the wagon with a cover on standing by the door. Pa put our bed in the wagon and hitched the horses on. Then we climbed in and drove away in the darkness. Read that once more, slowly, and think about who wrote it. This is the woman who told a room full of people in Detroit that her father never left a debt unpaid. She knew. She had been carried out to the wagon herself, half asleep in the dark because of a debt he could not pay. She wrote it down in her own hand in 1930. And she never let it near a children's book. That, I think, is the moment the whole evening turns on. Not because it makes her dishonest, because of what it costs to keep something like that for 50 years and then put it in a drawer. There is one more thing in that passage, and it is the detail that gives it away as memory rather than reconstruction. Pa put our bed in the wagon, not the trunk, not the stove, the bed, because the children were going back to sleep and he wanted somewhere to put them. A man running from a landlord at 2 a.m. is still a man who wants his daughters to lie down properly. She was 9 or 10. She was lifted out of a warm room in the dark, and there was a wagon at the door with a cover already on it, which means it had all been prepared while they slept, which means her mother knew and her father knew, and nobody had told the children. And then they drove away, and the horses were the ones Benjamin Bisbee had said he would take, and the cow that had been sold to pay him was not in the string behind. Where they went is Walnut Grove, back the way they had come, for the second time. 60 years later, when she wanted to write about her father, she wrote 9 books in which a wagon at the door is always the beginning of an adventure. Now she did give a reason for leaving Burr Oak out. She gave it in a letter, and it is a masterpiece of saying nothing. My family did live in Burr Oak for nearly 2 years, but I fear my memories of that time will not be very interesting, as they are more of the place than the people. More of the place than the people. This from the woman who had just written 20 pages about it. A shooting, a fire, a man burning his hand on his wife's hair, a schoolmaster who wouldn't let go of children's hands, a dead brother, a new sister, and a flight from a landlord in the dark. More of the place than the people is what you say to close a subject, and the person she was closing it with was her own daughter, who was trying to sell the book. Not very interesting. They went back to Walnut Grove in the late summer of 1877 and stayed until 1879. 2 more years, also missing from every book. Laura was 10 when they got back, and 12 when they left, and for most of that stretch she was working. She had a job at the Masters Hotel in Walnut Grove, waiting tables and keeping rooms, 10 years old. Think about the shape of the day, up before the guests. Carry the water, lay the tables, carry the plates in, carry the plates out, make the beds, sweep the rooms, and be pleasant to men you have never met. At 10 years old, in the same kind of building the family had just left in Iowa. There's one detail from that job I love, and it changes how you think about everything that came after. On her breaks, she read the New York Ledger. The Ledger was a story paper. Cheap weekly fiction, serials, romances, adventures, the sort of thing respectable people sniffed at and children swallowed whole. The museum that holds her papers calls it her first real introduction to fiction. That is the origin of everything else in this story, and it is worth saying slowly. The first storytelling that ever got inside Laura Ingalls was serial fiction, read standing up in a hotel kitchen at 10 years old, between shifts, in a town her family had failed in once already. A serial has to make you want the next one. A serial ends chapters in the right place. A serial knows that a good ending is worth more than an accurate one. She was taking a course in it, for free, on her feet, and nobody knew. 55 years later, an agent would complain that her true life story didn't have enough high points or crescendo. She knew what crescendo was. She'd been reading it at 10. Caroline Fraser puts the working years plainly. From the age of 9 onward, Laura spent much of her time working outside the home, often as a seamstress, to help support her family. From 9. Not from 15, which is roughly where the books let it start. From 9. And one of those jobs produced the single worst thing in the manuscript. She was hired out to stay overnight in a house and mind a child. She was somewhere around 11, and the pay was 50 cents a week. The sources disagree on the town, so I will not pin it down for you. She woke in the night and there was a drunk man standing at her bed telling her to lie down and be still. She told him she would scream. He left. She told her mother. Her mother told her she did not have to go back. That is the whole account. It is 4 sentences long in a manuscript of 74,000 words, and it is in none of the books, and there is no version of a children's book from 1932 in which it could have been. Meanwhile, Charles was quietly getting out of farming altogether. He kept a butcher shop in Walnut Grove. When the village incorporated in 1879, he was elected Justice of the Peace. Read those 2 sentences again with the books in your head. The man in the books is a farmer who cannot stop moving west. He is happiest with a rifle and a horizon. Towns make him restless. The whole emotional engine of 8 volumes is a father whose feet itch. The man in the record in 1879 is a small-town tradesman cutting meat for his neighbours. They had just elected him to office. In a village he had already left once and come back to. That is not a failure. In some ways it is the most successful he had ever been. A shop, a title, a wage, and people who trusted him enough to vote for him. It simply is not the man she wrote. The land papers tell the same story. He filed a homestead entry in Minnesota on the 9th of May, 1878. He had already given up the tree claim in March. He held the homestead until the 1st of December, 1880, and then relinquished that too more than a year after the family had gone. Laura Ingalls Wilder never wrote about the tree claim, and never wrote about that homestead. 2 more filings, 2 more years of intent, and neither of them made it to a page. And I want to note what that costs the reader, because it is not nothing. If you know about the butcher shop and the justice of the peace, then the move to Dakota Territory in 1879 is not a man following his nature. It is a man giving up a shop and an office and a settled position at 43 to try the land one more time. That is a far braver and far sadder decision than the one in the book, and she took it out. In 1879 they left for Dakota Territory. Caroline and the girls came by train and stepped down at the end of the line on the 9th of September. That is where the 5th book begins, and that is where the world picks the story back up. So let's count what the 5th book steps over. The 3 summers of locusts, not 1. The sworn statement of destitution. The 2 half-barrels of flour. The farm bought and sold in 3 days at a loss. A brother born and buried. 2 years in a hotel with a saloon next door and bullet holes in the wall. a schoolmaster, an offer to adopt her, a sister-born, a midnight departure over unpaid rent, 2 more years in Minnesota, a butcher shop, a justice of the peace, a 10-year-old waiting tables, a man at the foot of a bed, 5 years, near enough, and not a page. Let me put that in a form that might land harder. If you have read these books, you know the family's whole story from 1874 to 1879 as one thing. Plum Creek, the dugout, the grasshoppers, the church bell, the creek, Nellie Owens, and then the wagon turns for Dakota and the 5th book begins. You have been reading a bridge with the middle taken out. Between the last page of the 4th book and the first page of the 5th, a boy is born and dies. A girl is born. The family loses a farm and takes charity. It crosses 2 state lines. It lives in a hotel and works in that hotel. It runs from a debt in the dark, comes back to a town it had already failed in, and the father gives up farming entirely and opens a shop. Then the 5th book opens and everyone is on the platform at the end of the railroad going west, and the whole thing feels like the natural next step in a life of adventure. It isn't. It is the 4th or 5th attempt of a man in his 40s who has run out of other ideas. I do not think she cut those years because she was ashamed of them, exactly. Shame is too simple a word for what she was doing. I think she cut them because they will not hold the shape the rest of the story has. A book about a father moving west, testing himself against country, is a book with a spine. Add the eastward retreats and the flight in the dark and the shop, and it is not a story about the frontier anymore. It is a story about a family being pushed around by circumstances they cannot control, which is truer and much harder to sit through, and much harder to read to a child at bedtime. She had already written that version. It was in the tablets. Nobody wanted it. Here is how large that gap is, in practical terms. In 2002, the publisher of the Little House books commissioned a well-known children's novelist, Cynthia Rylant, to write a book called Old Town in the Green Groves, for one reason: to fill in the missing years between On the Banks of Plum Creek and By the Shores of Silver Lake. 70 years after the fact, the only way anyone could fill that hole was to invent something to put in it. And when you set all of it out in a row like that, the shape of what she removed becomes very hard to miss. It is not the sad things. Mary goes blind in these books. A baby dies in a later one. Crops fail. People freeze. She was not squeamish and she was not sentimental. Let me put that beyond doubt, because people who have not read the books since childhood tend to remember them as gentler than they are. In the 5th book, a family walks into a town with nothing and lives in a railroad shanty through a Dakota winter. In the 6th, a town starves for 113 days and burns its own furniture. In the 7th, a young woman goes off alone to teach in a house where she's frightened of the people. In the last one, a house burns and a baby son dies, and a young couple lose the farm. She put all of that in front of children, and she never once softened the cold. What she took out was different. Look again. A father who took relief. A father who ran from a landlord. A father who couldn't hold a farm and went into trade. A mother who nearly lost a daughter to a richer household. A house where children worked in front of strangers. A teacher who touched them. A man in the dark who told a little girl to be still. Every single one is a failure of protection. She kept every hardship that the family endured together, and she removed every occasion on which the family failed to keep its children safe. That is the rule. Once you have it, you can run it over the rest of her life like a template, and it fits, and it explains something that has bothered readers for 90 years without their being able to name it. People sometimes say the books are sentimental. They are not. Sentimental writing tells you how to feel about a thing. She almost never does. She tells you the temperature and the price and what somebody did with their hands and lets you work it out. What the books are is safe, not soft. Safe. However bad it gets, the same 6 people are in the house, and the door is shut and Pa is on the other side of it. That safety is the thing she manufactured. It is the one genuinely fictional element in 8 books of documented events. She built it by subtraction. She built it out of a childhood in which the door stood open a great deal more often than she ever let on. which is why I do not think this is a story about a woman covering something up. I think it is a story about a woman giving several million children something she had not had. She did it with the only material she owned, which were the facts of her own life, with the worst parts taken out, which is exactly what we're going to do next, in Smet, where the books come back on and where she was working with material every reader already thinks they know. Because in Dakota she couldn't cut things out. Everybody was watching. So she did something harder and cleverer, and in one case she flatly refused to do what her own daughter told her to. And that, for the moment, is that. The kettle can rest. We'll be in Dakota shortly. The family reached Dakota Territory in 1879, and from that point on, Laura Ingalls Wilder had a different problem. In Kansas, she was writing about a place with almost nobody in it, from the memory of a 4-year-old. In Burr Oak, she was writing about strangers she would never see again. In Smet, she was writing about a town that was still there, full of people who had been there with her, and whose grandchildren could read. You cannot cut a town, so in Smet she stopped cutting and started changing, and she stayed in that town, in one form or another, for 6 years, from the age of 12 to the age of 18, which is the longest she stood still in her entire childhood. 4 of the 8 books happen there. It is the closest thing to a home she ever had before Missouri. It is also where the people who could contradict her lived. Smet still had a newspaper when she was publishing. It had a memorial society by the end of her life. The children she taught had grandchildren of their own, and some of them wrote to her. So the method changes, and it changes for a practical reason. In Kansas, she could leave things out because nobody would notice. In Smet, somebody would. First, though, one number, because it closes something we've been carrying since the beginning. Charles Ingalls filed his Dakota homestead on the 19th of February, 1880. He received his final patent on the 7th of May, 1886. That is the only claim he ever proved up. In more than 30 years of buying, filing, breaking and walking away, across Wisconsin, Missouri, Kansas, Minnesota and Dakota Territory, one piece of ground came out the other end with his name on the paper. He sold it on the 18th of February 1892 to a man named George Elderkin for $1,200. There was a mortgage on it, taken out the previous April for $760, so after 12 years the net came to something under $400. Hold that beside the $5.25. We're not finished with that arithmetic yet. But I want to be fair to the man before we go on, because it's easy to make Charles Ingalls sound like a fool, and he was not one. Count what he actually did between 1863 and 1886. He bought and sold in Wisconsin twice, and made money on it both times. He lost 18 months and $900 in Missouri. He squatted in Kansas and got out before it cost him. He filed in Minnesota, paid it out, and sold at a small loss. He filed twice more in Minnesota and let both go. He filed in Dakota Territory and held on for 6 years and got the patent. That is not a drifter. That is a man betting repeatedly at long odds with everything he had against country that had never been farmed by anybody, in a decade when the weather itself broke. Most of the men who did what he did worse. He got one. He held it. And when he sold it, he was left with under $400, and he spent the rest of his life in a town doing carpentry, which is a thing he was genuinely good at. His daughter knew all of that. And when she came to write him, she did not write a man who lost 6 times and won once. She wrote a man who was always about to win, and whose losses were weather and locusts and government, and never once his own judgment. That is the largest single change in the whole series, and it is not a fact she altered. It is an interpretation she chose, and she never wavered from it in 25 years. Now, Mary. Every reader knows what happened to Mary Ingalls. In 1879, at 14, she came down with scarlet fever, and the fever took her sight, and she was blind for the rest of her life. Scarlet fever is in the book. Scarlet fever is what generations of children were told. Scarlet fever is what everybody says. The contemporary evidence does not say scarlet fever. What the local newspapers of the time described was something they called spinal sickness. What they reported was that hemorrhage of the brain had set in, and that one side of her face became partially paralysed. Facial paralysis, a stroke-like event. That is not the picture of scarlet fever. In February of 2013, 4 physicians published a paper in the journal Pediatrics, working from Wilder's memoirs, her letters, and the newspapers of the day. Their title asked the question directly: how did Mary Ingalls lose her sight? Their conclusion was viral meningoencephalitis, an infection of the brain and the membranes around it. Now here is the part that matters for tonight, and it is the author's own reasoning, not mine. Scarlet fever, in the 1930s, was a word every mother in America understood and feared. Viral meningoencephalitis was not a word at all for most readers. Substituting the famous illness for the accurate one made a 14-year-old girl's blindness legible. She replaced a true cause nobody could picture with a false cause everybody could. And then something happened that changes the whole character of what we're doing here. Rose Wilder Lane, her daughter, editing the manuscripts, advised her to leave Mary's blindness out of the children's books altogether. Too dark, too much, not for children. Her mother said no. She kept it. She kept the blindness, she kept the school for the blind, and the sister who never got her sight back, in books meant for 8-year-olds. And she did it against professional advice from a far more commercially successful writer who happened to be her own child. I want that on the record, because we have spent an hour on the things she took out, and it would be easy to end up with a portrait of a woman who flinched. She didn't flinch. She chose. And when she thought a hard thing belonged in, she put it in and held it there. Which brings us to the winter. The book is called The Long Winter. That was not her title. She called it The Hard Winter, and Harper turned the title down in 1940 as too bleak for young readers. There are 2 letters about it, and together they are the funniest thing in this whole story. The first is Wilder writing to her daughter on the 3rd of June, 1939, worried about what she'd produced. She said she was afraid she'd made rather a dark picture. Not so much sweetness and light as the other books. The second is Rose, a year later, on the 5th of June, 1940, writing to their agent about the publisher's objection. My God, if The Hard Winter as a title is too depressing, what is the book? Quite. It is a book in which a town runs out of food and burns its furniture. So what actually happened in Smet that winter, and how close is the novel? Closer than you might expect, and off in specific places. The October blizzard is the opening of the book, and in the book it comes in the night, the way blizzards do in stories. It came on the 15th of October 1880 in daylight. It followed rain, then sleet, then ice. It dropped about 2 feet of snow, and it shut the railroad for 10 days. The famine is real, and the dates are exact. No train reached Smet between the 13th of January and the 6th of May, 1881. That is 113 days. The worst of the drifting was not where the book puts it. The book has the crucial cut west of Tracy. The genuine problem was further east near Sleepy Eye in Minnesota. The book gives you a town of 75 or 80 people. About 50 families wintered inside Smet, and the school. In the novel, school closes for the winter, and the closing is one of the ways you feel the town shutting down around the family. The superintendent's own report says school did not close, and that daily attendance stayed good. None of that is a lie. All of it is a novelist tightening. Move the drift closer, shrink the town, close the school, and the walls come in. And what she did not need to tighten at all was the work, which is why those chapters are the best thing in the series. The hay twisting is real. When the coal ran out and the wood was gone, people burned slough hay, and loose hay burns like paper, so you had to twist it into hard sticks first. 2 hands, a length of hay, a twist, a fold, a tuck. Each stick burned for a few minutes. Somebody had to sit by the stove all day making them, and their hands split open, and they made more. The coffee mill is real. seed wheat ground a handful at a time in a little hand mill on the table, turned by whoever had an arm left, because a coffee mill will not grind faster than a wrist can go. That is what she was best at, and it is worth naming clearly. Give this woman a documented, repetitive physical task, and she will hold you inside it for 20 pages. Nobody has ever done it better in English. She did not have to change any of that. It was already the right size. But there was somebody in that house all winter who is not in the book at all, and this one is not a tightening. His name was George Emmett Masters, born in 1853. In July of 1879 he had married a young woman named Margaret Gilmore in Walnut Grove. Everybody called her Maggie. In May of 1880, Maggie Masters gave birth to a son, Arthur, in the Ingalls house in Smet. Caroline Ingalls attended, and so did a neighbour, Mrs. Garland. And then the three of them stayed, through the autumn, through October, through the 113 days, through the twisting of hay and the grinding of wheat in a coffee mill, and every single scene in that book. There were 3 more people in the house, one of them a baby under a year old. Here is Wilder on it, in the manuscript. We had not asked or wanted them to stay with us, but they were out of money and had nowhere to go, so they just stayed on. The researcher who has done the most work on de Smet's records concludes that Wilder took them out deliberately to keep the story clean. Fewer mouths, fewer hands, no outsider sharing the labour or the credit. That is almost certainly right, and it is a perfectly ordinary novelist's decision. I'm going to put one more fact next to it, and then leave it alone, because I can't prove what I'd like to prove. George Masters was the son of Samuel O. Masters. Samuel Masters was the schoolmaster in Burr Oak, the tall, thin man with the bad teeth who took hold of the girl's hands. I cannot tell you that Laura Ingalls Wilder was thinking about the father when she left the son out of the book. Nobody can. There is no letter. What I can tell you is that both men had been inside her family's life, and that neither of them made it onto a single page of the 8 books. She wrote about the father in private at 63. About the son she wrote nothing at all. Make of that what you will. I've thought about it a good deal, and I keep arriving at the same place. Now, Jack, remember the dog, and by the shores of Silver Lake, the family's about to leave Plum Creek for Dakota. Jack the brindle bulldog has walked beside that wagon through the whole series, and now he is old and tired, and he lies down and dies in his sleep. It is one of the most quietly devastating pages in children's literature. Millions of people have cried over it. I have. Jack did not die there. Jack was traded away, along with the horses, years earlier, at the departure from Kansas, when Laura was about 4 years old. So the dog we all watched die peacefully at the end of a long life, surrounded by his family, was in fact handed to a stranger with the team when the family could not afford to keep him. Traded. With the horses. And she moved his death 8 years forward and put it exactly where a childhood ends and an adolescence begins. That is not a mistake. That is craft. She needed a door between the little girl and the young woman, and she gave the job to the dog, and she gave him the death he should have had. If you want one example of what this woman actually was, it's that. She was not covering up. She was, very quietly, being merciful, in a way that also happened to work structurally. The renaming is easier to see once you know to look for it. Take Nellie Oleson, the mean girl of the whole franchise, the one everybody remembers, the one the television series turned into an institution. She never existed. Not because nothing happened, but because 3 girls did. Nellie Winfield Owens, born the 2nd of August, 1869, in Walnut Grove, whose parents kept the mercantile. She's the Nellie of On the Banks of Plum Creek. Genevieve Maud Masters, born the 12th of November, 1867, in Hornby, New York, who came west to Walnut Grove and then to Smet. She's the Nellie of Little Town on the Prairie. Wilder wrote that Genevieve sneered at the other girls in school because they were Westerners, and Estella Gilbert, born in May of 1864, who had a claim north of the Ingalls place. She's the Nellie of these happy golden years. 3 real girls, 1 invented name, 1 continuous enemy. and they were not the same kind of girl at all, which is the interesting part. Nellie Owens was a shopkeeper's daughter in a village where the Ingalls family had almost nothing. Her parents kept the mercantile. She had the things in the window. That is one sort of enemy, and it is the sort a hungry child invents nothing about, because the difference is already there on the shelf. Genevieve Masters was something else. She'd come out from New York State, from a place called Hornby, and she looked down on the Prairie girls for being Prairie girls. Wilder wrote that Genevieve sneered at the other girls in school because they were Westerners. That is not an enemy of money. That is an enemy of class. Imported. Estella Gilbert was a young woman in Smet with a claim north of the Ingalls place, and by then Laura was not a child, and the rivalry had a young man in it. 3 separate injuries from 3 separate stages of a life. A poor child looking at a shop, a country girl being sneered at, a young woman with a rival. She welded them into one girl with a name and a hair ribbon, and put her in 4 books, and she is now more famous than any of the 3 women who made her. And then there's this, which is the strangest single thing I found all week. Years later, Wilder told fans what became of Nellie. She said Nellie married, moved out to Washington State, and that her husband went to prison for embezzlement. Genevieve Masters married a man named William Graham Van Renwick in 1888. In 1895 he was convicted of embezzlement and forgery. He was sentenced to 2 years in the penitentiary at Walla Walla in Washington State and pardoned in March of 1896. She was telling readers the true later life of a real woman and attaching it to a character who did not exist. Notice the name again too. Masters. That family runs right through this story like a thread you keep finding in the weave. The Brewsters are the same trick, done for a different reason. In these happy golden years, Laura at 15 goes off to teach her first school and boards with a family called Brewster in a claim shanty where the wife is bitterly unhappy and the household is frightening. Their name was Bushy. The school was held in a claim shanty on Dave Gilbert's homestead, and Laura boarded with Louis and Olive Bushy. In the manuscript she used the real name. In the novel she changed every one of them. Joseph Bushy became Mr. Brewster. Louis became Louis. Olive, who was born Olive Delilah Eisenberger, became Lib. Isaac Bushy became Clarence, and the real Clarence became Tommy. Fanny Ruth became Ruby. A boy called John Morrison became Johnny. She kept the shanty, the cold, the misery and the fear. She took the surname off it. These were living people with living relatives in a small county, and she was publishing. And it is worth noticing which way that particular kindness runs. She could have changed the family into pleasant people. That would have been the easy fix, and it would have cost her the best chapters in the book. Instead, she kept every unpleasant thing they did and took away the one detail that would have let a neighbour identify them. That is a writer choosing the story over the comfort of the page and then choosing a stranger's dignity over her own convenience, in that order, in the same decision. The de Smet books are full of that. She names the people she liked. She veils the people she did not. Almanzo is Almanzo. Cap Garland is Cap Garland. Mrs. Boast is Mrs. Boast. The family in the shanty is a family with a false name and a real temper. If you want a rule of thumb for reading these books, that is a good one. When she gives you a full name, she is telling you it happened to a person she was willing to stand behind. When the name sounds slightly wrong, look it up. That, incidentally, is the same reason the school terms in the books are simpler than the ones in the ledgers. She taught 3 schools, the Bushy School in the winter of 1883 and 1884, with 11 children of school age on the roll, then the Perry School, 2 months beginning the 28th of April 1884 at $25 a month with 3 pupils, then the Wilkin School, 3 months after her examinations in April of 1885, again at $25 a month with 7 pupils identified. 3 pupils, $25 a month. That is what teaching on the Dakota Prairie actually was. Not a room of scrubbed faces, a handful of children in a claim shanty, a young woman not much older than the eldest of them, and a wage that was worth having because there was so little else a girl could earn. And she got some of their names wrong. The researcher who has gone through the school records finds Wilder misnaming pupils in both the manuscript and the novel, a Peterson mixed up with a Harrison, the spellings of Glover and Webb and Dwight muddled, miscounts of who was in which room. I like that more than I can easily explain. It is the one place in this whole story where she is simply an old woman doing her best from memory, with no agenda at all, getting a name slightly wrong the way anybody would. The most famous scene from that stretch is the chapter called A Knife in the Dark, where the wife stands over her sleeping husband holding a butcher knife. I have to be honest with you about that one. The people who work on this material closely say that considerable liberties were taken with that particular incident, without specifying which, so I'll put it this way. Something bad enough happened in that shanty that a girl remembered it for 50 years and her mother's family never forgot it. Whether the knife was in the room is not settled, and she was not 15. The teaching certificate survives. It is dated the 10th of December, 1883, which makes her 16 when she got it, and she turned 17 during that winter term. The books say 15. There is a competing reading of the date that would make it 1882, and her 15 after all, and I'll flag it rather than hide it. Two sources working directly from the certificate favour 1883. Either way, notice what the number does. 15 is a child sent out to work. 16 going on 17 is a young woman with a job. The younger she is, the more the reader's heart goes with her. She did the same thing at the other end of the story. In the books, Laura and Almanzo are nearly inevitable. He drives out to fetch her every Friday through a Dakota winter, 24 miles there and back, and there is no real competition. Those drives, by the way, are true, and they are the best argument for the man that exists. A young woman is teaching in a shanty 12 miles out, in a house where she's frightened, in a Dakota January. Every Friday a sleigh comes for her, and every Sunday it takes her back. 24 miles each weekend in open air, in weather that killed people that decade. For a girl who had given him no particular encouragement, and who said afterwards that at the time she was mostly just glad to get home, he did it all winter. That is not a scene she needed to improve. The manuscript has at least 4 other young men interested in her. And Almanzo's own age is a genuine muddle. His headstone and the book say he was born on the 13th of February 1857. 3 separate censuses, in 1860, 1870 and 1875, all put his birth 2 years later in 1859. That matters for one of the best-loved details in The Long Winter, where Almanzo is 19 and secretly too young to hold a homestead, because the law required 21. On the 1857 date, he was 23 in 1880 and perfectly legal. The secret is a story. There is another small one, and it belongs to the girl rather than the woman. In By the Shores of Silver Lake, Laura goes out to the railroad grade with her father. She watches the camp and the teams and the scrapers. It is one of the most vivid stretches of work writing in the series. It appears she never went. She'd heard it described, probably many times, probably by her father and her cousin, and she put herself into it, because a narrator who is not there cannot show you anything. That is not deceit. That is the oldest trick in the trade. But it does mean that one of the best observed passages in the books was observed by somebody else. Even Farmer Boy, the gentlest book in the series, has a hole cut in it. 2 of Almanzo's brothers and sisters are missing. One is a brother born too late to be in it. The other is a sister who had already left home. Her name was Laura Wilder. Almanzo's sister was called Laura. Put her in the book and every reader in America gets confused about who the author is. So out she went. And there is a stack of pages in the surviving Farmer Boy manuscript that never got printed, in which the Wilder family sit down and discuss whether to go west and decide. Somebody cut them. That's a whole conversation about the decision that made everything else in Almanzo's life possible, written, typed, and dropped. One last document from Dakota, and then we go to Missouri. On the 2nd of December, 1884, Charles Ingalls filed a tree claim on a quarter of Section 28. He gave it up on the 8th of June, 1885. 6 months. He held it for 6 months. Laura was married that August. She was 18. Almanzo was either 28 or 26, depending on which record you believe. They were married on the 25th of August, 1885, at the minister's house, quietly, because his sister was coming and there would have been a fuss. The last of the 8 books ends there, on the road home to a claim shanty he had built and furnished for her, with the sun going down. It is the best ending she ever wrote, and it is also the last easy day either of them had for a long time. But that is a different night, and this one has somewhere else to go. Now let me turn the ledger over, because we have been running down one column all night and there is another one. These are the things people assume she made up, which she did not. The wolves are real. In Kansas, a pack circled a house in the night while a family sat inside with a rifle and a dog. That happened. Dr. Tann is real. A black physician with a homestead less than a mile off, who came when the whole household had malaria. The dugout on Plum Creek is real, down to the willow bough door and the grass on the roof. The grasshoppers are real, and worse than the book says, 3 summers instead of 1. The 113 days without a train are real, to the day, on both ends. The haystacks and the coffee mill are real. The green pumpkin pie is in the record. The tin cups and the peppermint sticks at Christmas are in the record, brought by somebody, whatever his name was. Cap Garland was a real young man in Smet, and he really did die at 26, when the boiler of a threshing engine blew up in a field. The Bouchie family were real people in a real claim shanty, and she really did teach there at 16, and she really was frightened. Mary really did go blind, and really did go to a college for the blind, and really never saw again. Almanzo really did drive 24 miles every weekend of a Dakota winter to bring a schoolteacher home. And this is why the accusation people reach for does not fit. The word invented is wrong. Almost nothing in 8 books is invented. What she did was subtract, compress, rename, redate, and rearrange, which is what every memoirist who has ever lived has done, and the difference is that in her case somebody has since gone and checked all of it against the deeds. Every one of the changes is small. None of them is dishonest in the way a lie is dishonest. Line them up, though, and they all lean the same direction, and it is the same direction as everything in the 2 hours before this. Something is being protected. A father's name, a family's competence, a little girl's safety, a dog, a reader's heart. But knowing what she protected still doesn't tell us why she sat down to do it in the first place, or why in 1930 and not in 1910 or 1920. She was 63 years old. She'd been writing for pay for nearly 20 years already. Something moved. To find out what, we have to leave Dakota for good and go south to a stone house on a ridge in Missouri in the last week of a decade that had just ended badly for everybody. The fire settles into itself. Come with me. In September of 1894, Laura and Almanzo Wilder bought 40 acres of stony hillside near Mansfield, Missouri, for $400. The deed went in her name. There was already debt on it. $200 against the land and another $140 owed to a nursery for fruit trees they had not yet planted. So they started $340 down, on ground the neighbours thought was worth very little. They called it Rocky Ridge. The house began as 2 rooms in 1895. By 1913 it had 10, added on a room at a time as the apples came in. And out in Dakota, the family she came from was thinning out. Charles Ingalls died on the 8th of June 1902 in Smet of heart disease. He was 66. He had sold the homestead 10 years before, in February of 1892 for $1,200 against a mortgage of $760, under $400 for 12 years of a man's life on his one successful claim. He spent his last years in town in a house he had built with his own hands on 3rd Street, doing carpentry and holding small public offices. Caroline Ingalls lived another 22 years in that house. She died on the 20th of April, 1924, at 84 after a long illness. And in Missouri, meanwhile, her second daughter was becoming something nobody in this story expected. Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a farm wife who suddenly wrote a book at 65. That is the story everyone tells, and it is not true. She had been a working writer since 1911, nearly 20 years of columns for the Missouri Ruralist, paid, regular, under her own name, on poultry and orchards and household economy and the price of things. And she had a second job that almost nobody mentions, which I find the most interesting fact about her middle age. She was secretary and treasurer of the Mansfield National Farm Loan Association. This was a local cooperative under the federal farm loan system, tied to the land bank in St. Louis. It made mortgage loans to farmers. And there is a primary document for it, which is rare in this story and worth savouring. An advertisement in the Mansfield Mirror on the 28th of September 1922 carries the line, Mrs. A.J. Wilder, Secretary. She held that post for most of the 1920s. The best sources give it as roughly 1919 to 1927. The museum says she processed more than $1 million in government loans over those years, and I'll give you that as the museum's figure rather than as a documented total, because no accounting for it has ever been published. Picture it anyway. The woman who would write about a father who could never hold on to land spent 8 years at a desk in a small Missouri town, deciding which farmers got mortgages. She had seen it from both sides of the table. Then, in the space of 4 years, everything that anchored her came loose. Ma died in 1924. Mary died in 1928. Mary had gone up to Keystone in the Black Hills in June of 1927 to stay with Carrie. In January she had a fall and a stroke. There was another stroke near the end. She died on the 17th of October 1928, and they brought her body down to Smet and buried her beside her mother and father. Carrie wrote to Laura in Mansfield while it was happening. 3 lines survive, and they are as good as anything in the novels. Mary had another stroke Saturday. She has lost her speech, and Laura, I doubt if she rallies. And then, afterwards, this. She was speaking of you that morning. Notice what those letters prove, quite apart from what they say. They were addressed to Missouri. Laura was not at the bedside, 900 miles away, opening envelopes, waiting for the next one. She was 61 years old, and she was now the eldest living Ingalls. Everyone who had been in the little grey house with her was either dead or younger than she was. That Christmas, she and Almanzo moved into a new house. Their daughter had built it for them. Rose Wilder Lane had made a great deal of money in the 1920s writing magazine fiction. She put it into a stone cottage on a far ridge of the farm, on 40 acres her parents had bought in 1919. It had modern heat and modern plumbing, and it was a genuine gift, and it went well over what she had planned to spend. I'll tell you what, I can't tell you. There is a figure that circulates for what the rock house cost, and it has no source behind it that I could find, so I'm going to leave it out rather than repeat it at you as fact. The Wilders moved in at Christmas, 1928. 14 months later, in that house, Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down and began to write her life. Here is what she used. Number 2, lead pencils. Cheap, wide-lined school tablets, the kind sold in a grocery store. We know the brand because the project that catalogued her materials found it. 50/50 tablets from the Springfield Grocer Company. Not a typewriter. She had one in the house. She used a pencil. She filled around 400 tablet pages, something close to 74,000 words, and on the 7th of May, 1930, she finished, and she handed the whole stack to her daughter. She was 63 years and 3 months old. What she had written was not a children's book and was never meant to be one. It was an adult memoir aimed at the magazines. It contained the drunk man at the bed and the bullet holes, and the man burning his hand in his wife's hair, the schoolmaster, the wagon in the dark, the baby, all of it, in order, in her own hand. Then it went out into the world, and the world was not interested. 2 days after she handed it over, on the 9th of May, Rose sent a sample to her agent, a man named Carl Brandt. On the 17th, she mailed him the whole typed copy. He returned it, not interested. They went at the magazines next, which was always the plan, because magazine serialization was where the money was. The Saturday Evening Post, Ladies' Home Journal, Country Gentleman, The Atlantic. Every one of them said no. A later agent, George T. Bye, took the polished version around for 2 more years and could not place it either, and he wrote the sentence that must have stung most of all. It didn't warm me enough. It didn't seem to have enough high points or crescendo. Not enough high points. A book containing a dead baby, a shooting, a fire, an attempted assault on a child, 3 years of locusts, a 100-day famine, and a family fleeing its landlord in the middle of the night. The problem was not that it lacked drama. The problem was that it was true, so it had no shape. Things happened and then other things happened. That is what a life is, and it is not what a book is. So in late July of 1930, Rose started cutting a different version. Not for adults, for children. Just the Wisconsin material. Just the little girl. About 20 pages. She called it When Grandma Was a Little Girl, and on the 17th of August she posted it to an illustrator she knew named Berta Hader. Hader passed it to Marion Fiery, who ran children's books at Alfred A. Knopf. In the first week of February 1931, Marion Fiery did something that must have been extraordinary to receive. She wrote directly to Laura Ingalls Wilder, a 64-year-old woman in Missouri who had never published a book. She had read it with the greatest interest. She wanted more of it. And Knopf would like 3 books. From a stack of tablets nobody had wanted a year earlier. And then Knopf shut down its children's apartment before the contract could be signed, and Marion Fiery, decently, wrote again to release her. The manuscript went across town to Harper & Brothers and landed on the desk of a woman named Virginia Kirkus, who had just started their department of books for boys and girls. The story Kirkus told afterwards is that she began reading it on the train home to Connecticut and was so far inside it that she missed her stop. She bought it. I want to pause on that whole sequence for a moment, because if you have ever had something turned down, it is worth having in full. A woman finishes a book in May of 1930. Her agent returns it inside a fortnight. 4 magazines refuse it. A second agent carries it around for 2 years and cannot sell it, and tells her it lacks crescendo. So the book is taken apart and a 5th of it is rebuilt as something else entirely. It goes to an illustrator who is a friend of a friend, who hands it to an editor, who offers 3 books, and then that publisher closes the entire department. At that point she's 64 years old, she has been trying for a year and a half, and she has been told no by everybody in the business, and it's sold on the next desk it landed on, to a woman who missed her train stop. Little House in the Big Woods was copyrighted on the 6th of April 1932. It cost $2. Helen Sewell drew the pictures. The jacket was homespun coloured linen, and the boards inside were printed with tiny strawberry leaves and blossoms. The New York Herald Tribune reviewed it that June. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 65 years old, and the first royalty check she received for it came to $529.69. Now put that number next to the other one. 2 half barrels of flour, $5.25, sworn for in Minnesota on the 30th of November, 1875, by a man who had to write down that he was wholly without means, 57 years from the flour to the check, same family, and the check was for the book that left the flour out, which brings us to the part of tonight I've been walking you toward for 2 hours, and it is the part where the usual story falls apart. You will hear, more or less everywhere, that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote the Little House books because the crash of 1929 wiped out the family savings and they needed the money. It is a good story. It is not what the record shows. Rose had invested her own money and her parents' money in a concern called the George Palmer Company, which paid regular dividends. Those dividends were what the family was living on. They did not stop in October of 1929. They stopped on the 19th of November 1931. We know the date exactly because Rose wrote it in her diary in capital letters. Palmer income stopped. November of 1931. By then, Pioneer Girl had been written for 18 months. Rejected by an agent. Rejected by 4 magazines. Cut down for children. Sent to Knopf. Offered a contract. Orphaned and sold to Harper. The money ran out after the work was done. And there is a second fact that finishes the argument off completely. On the 14th of May, 1932, Rose Wilder Lane sat down and wrote out what she owed. $1,000 to the bank, $2,400 to a friend, and to her mother, $2,700 of principal, plus that year's interest, plus the $500 a year she'd been sending her parents since 1921. $2,700. Laura had lent it to her. In the spring of 1932, 6 weeks after Little House in the Big Woods came out, Laura Ingalls Wilder was not a destitute old woman writing for grocery money. She was her daughter's creditor, so the financial explanation, which is the one almost everybody reaches for, does not survive contact with the diaries. Something else was going on, and I think we've been watching it all night. Look at what she was doing in 1930. Her mother had died in 1924. Her sister Mary had died in 1928, 900 miles away, speaking of her that morning. Her father had been gone since 1902. She was the last one who had been in the room. She was 63 and there was nobody left to check her, and nobody left to remember it with her, and she picked up a pencil. There is one more piece before the answer, and it hurt her. In September of 1932, 5 months after her mother's first book appeared, Rose sold a novel of her own to the Saturday Evening Post. Her agent's telegram survives, and it is 4 words long. Post takes hurricane at 3,000. 10 days later, the check came. $2,700, after the agent's 10%. The same figure to the dollar that she owed her mother. The book was called Let the Hurricane Roar. It was about a young couple homesteading on the Dakota Prairie, and it drew on her grandparents' lives, including a grasshopper plague that had come straight out of her mother's childhood at Plum Creek. And the 2 main characters were named Charles and Carolyn. Laura saw the advertisement. Here is what she said. The names aren't right. Caroline and Charles. They don't belong in that place at that time. I don't know. It's all wrong. That is not a woman complaining about copyright. Listen to it again. They don't belong in that place at that time. Her parents' names, on strangers, in the wrong year, on the wrong prairie. She had spent 2 years getting the dates right in pencil, and her daughter had taken the 2 names that mattered most and put them somewhere they had never been. In public, she was diplomatic. She said the book was, of course, fiction, with incidents and anecdotes gathered here and there and some purely imaginary. 16 years later, she was still saying, mildly, that it created confusion. Which brings us at last to Detroit. On the 16th of October, 1937, during Children's Book Week, Laura Ingalls Wilder stood up in front of a book fair audience and explained herself. She was 70 years old. 4 books were out. It is the only substantial account of her own intentions that she ever gave. She told them about her father's stories, and the evening lamp and the fiddle. She told them she had come to understand that in her own life she represented a whole period of American history. She said she wanted children now to understand more about the beginning of things, to know what is behind the things they see. And then she told them a story about the Bender family. The Benders, she said, kept a tavern on the road to Independence, in Kansas, when she was small, and travellers went in and did not come out, and bodies were found buried in the garden, including a child's. She said her father rode out with the vigilante party that went after them. She said that when he came home, he would say only, "They will never be found." It is a marvellous piece of storytelling, and it could not have happened. The Bender killings were not discovered until the spring of 1873. Harper's Weekly illustrated them that June. The Ingalls family left Kansas in the spring of 1871, 2 years before anybody knew there was anything to find. Charles Ingalls was in Wisconsin, and there is a footnote that makes it stranger still. When the Bender saga appears in the typescript of her memoir, it is not in her handwriting and never was. Rose put it in, but here is why she was telling it that day, and this is the sentence the whole evening has been walking toward. She told the Bender story to explain something, and what she said when she had finished it was this: "You will agree it is not a fit story for a children's book, but it shows there were other dangers on the frontier besides wild Indians, and then, more plainly still, there were some stories I wanted to tell, but would not be responsible for putting in a book for children, even though I knew them as a child. Even though I knew them as a child." She's telling a room full of librarians out loud in 1937 that she knew things she left out. Not forgot, knew, and chose. She said one more thing that day, and it is the closest she ever came to handing over the key. Sister Mary and I knew of these things, but some way were shielded from the full terror of them. Shielded. Stop on that word for a moment, because it is doing more work than any other word in this story. It is a passive construction. Somebody else does the shielding. A child does not shield herself. Her parents shield her, and the shield either holds or it does not, and it is a word about a wall, not about an absence. A shielded child is not a child in a world where nothing bad happens. She is a child on the safe side of something. That is exactly what the 8 books are. Not a world without hunger, cold, blindness, blizzards, or death. A world in which those things are on the other side of the wall, and the wall holds. Now, was she shielded? The manuscript says otherwise. The manuscript has a schoolmaster who wouldn't let go of her hands, a drunk man at the foot of her bed at 11, on 50 cents a week. Bullet holes in the wall of the room she slept in, a man burning while he dragged his wife by the hair, a landlord who came for the horses, a brother who straightened out his little body and was dead. She was not shielded. She was 9, and 10, and 11, and she was standing right there for all of it, and she remembered every detail for 54 years. But that is the childhood she wrote. She sat down in a stone house in Missouri at 63, with both her parents dead and her eldest sister buried, and she wrote the version in which the shielding worked, in which the father always found a way, in which nobody came into the bedroom, in which the family, however hungry and however cold, and however far from anywhere, held. Not to fool anybody. She said so herself at Detroit, in the plainest sentence she ever wrote about her own work. All I have told is true. But it is not the whole truth. That is not a confession, and it is not an apology. It is a statement of method, from a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and expected to be understood. Every story in those books happened. The wolves circled the house, the locusts came, the town ran out of wheat. Mary went blind. Every single thing she put on the page is a thing that occurred. She simply did not put down all of it. She left out the parts where the grown-ups could not manage, and she gave the dog a good death. She gave herself 2 extra years so that a small girl could carry the story. She took a debt and made it a departure. She took a brother and let him rest where he was, 9 months old. 1st of November, 1875, to the 27th of August, 1876. An unmarked grave on a farm in Minnesota that nobody has been able to find since. He is in the pencil manuscript. He is in no book. Before we set this down, there is one argument about her I should put in front of you honestly. You will run into it if you go looking, and leaving it out would be exactly the thing we have spent all night examining. For 30 years now there has been a serious dispute about who actually wrote the Little House books. In 1993, a scholar named William Holtz published a biography of Rose Wilder Lane, arguing that Rose was, in effect, the author, and that her mother supplied the raw material. Rose was the professional. Rose typed every manuscript, moved episodes, cut and added, and by her own admission put a whole section about the Bender family into the memoir that her mother had never written. Against that, the historian John E. Miller points out that the books with the least of Rose's fingerprints on them are the first and the seventh. Little House in the Big Woods, which started everything. These happy golden years, which many readers think is the best of them, and the first 4 years is Laura's alone. His conclusion is that the lasting work belongs to the mother rather than the daughter. Pamela Smith Hill, who edited the memoir, treats it as what it plainly looks like from the paper, a genuine, difficult, unequal collaboration between two people who could not have done it apart and did not enjoy doing it together. There is one more piece of it that I find almost unbearable. Rose Wilder Lane spent the rest of her life insisting in public that the books were 100% fact. She once threatened legal action against a young researcher who suggested otherwise. The daughter, who had personally inserted a fictional massacre into her mother's autobiography, went to her grave defending its accuracy. The tablets themselves are still here. They are in the vault of the museum at Rocky Ridge in Mansfield, treated against the acid in the cheap paper, too brittle to put on a wall. In November of 2011, 2 editors opened them and became the first people to read that handwriting since the 1930s. One of them noticed something about the pages that I have not been able to stop thinking about. There are almost no crossings out, almost no false starts. Hold that. We will come back for it in a moment, because it turns out to mean more than it looks like, and there is not one manuscript. There are 4, and knowing that changes what the word pioneer girl even means. There is the handwritten one, in her own pencil, at Mansfield. That is the only text that is hers alone, with nobody else's hand in it. Then there are 3 typescripts, all of them Rose's work at the keys, and each one shorter and smoother than the last. The one they sent to Carl Brandt runs 160 pages. A revised copy runs 126. The most polished one, the one George By carried around for 2 years, runs 195, and that is the one with the Bender killings in it. 4 versions of one childhood, getting steadily more like a book and steadily less like a life, and none of them selling. Those typescripts are not in Missouri. They are in Iowa, at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, in Rose's papers. Which is where I should correct something, because it is the most common mistake made about this material, and I would rather hand it to you straight. There are 3 pencil tablets at the Hoover Library too, and people constantly assume they are Pioneer Girl. They are not. They are a different manuscript altogether, called The First 3 Years, which is the book that came out after her death as The First 4 Years. The editor who has handled both says those Hoover tablets are in far rougher shape, full of strikeovers, with eraser holes rubbed right through the cheap paper. Rougher shape. Now go back to what the editors found in Mansfield and see what it means. That is what a first draft looks like. Strikeovers. Erasures rubbed through the page. A woman arguing with herself in pencil about how to say a thing. The Pioneer Girl tablets do not look like that. They are clean. So the manuscript in the vault, the one everybody now calls her raw and unedited memoir, is not raw at all. It is the version she had already decided on, copied out in a steady hand for the typist, with the arguing done somewhere we cannot see. Even her private draft is a second thought. They published Pioneer Girl in 2014, 84 years after she wrote it, and 57 years after she died. It came out from a small university press in South Dakota, with a scholarly apparatus that runs to hundreds of pages of annotation, because almost every paragraph needs one. It became, improbably, a bestseller, a 400-page annotated memoir by a dead woman from a state historical society sold out its print runs. Everybody wanted to know what she left out. She was 90 when she died, in the farmhouse at Rocky Ridge, on the 10th of February 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday. The books had made her famous by then, and she'd spent the last 20 years of her life answering letters from children who wanted to know whether it was all real. She always told them yes, and she was telling them the truth, in the way she meant it, and in the way she told a room in Detroit when she was 70 years old and had nothing left to prove. All of it is true. It is only that it is not all of it. I think about her on that last morning of the manuscript in May of 1930, in a stone house her daughter built, 63 years old, squaring up 400 pages of pencil on a table. Everyone who could have argued with her was dead. She could have written any version she liked. She wrote the hard one first, in her own hand, so it would exist. And then she wrote the gentle one for us, so we would have somewhere to go at night. There is a version of tonight that ends with an accusation, and I do not think it would be honest. She's been accused, at various times, of sanitizing the frontier and of hiding her father's failures, of writing a myth of self-reliance the record does not support, of leaving the Osage out of their own story. Some of that criticism is fair and some of it is careless, and all of it is easier to make than the thing she actually did. Here is what I keep coming back to instead. Every single item we have gone through tonight she wrote down first. The relief oath is not in the books because she left it out, but we know about the flower because she recorded the year. The night flight is not in the books, and we have that paragraph because she wrote it. The schoolmaster, the man at her bed, the bullet holes, the baby. She is the source of the evidence against her own version. A woman covering something up does not spend a year and a half in pencil setting it all down in order and handing it to her daughter to type. She could have burned it. She could have written nothing. She was 63 and nobody had asked her for a memoir and nobody bought it when she offered it. She wrote it because it happened and because she was the last one left who knew. And then, separately, she made something else out of it and told a room in Detroit exactly what she had done, in one sentence, without being asked. That is not deception. That is a working writer with two jobs, doing both of them. Both of them are hers. Both of them are true. You're allowed to love the second one just as much as you did this morning, and now you know what it cost to make it. The lamp gets carried to the last room. The fire settles into itself. Somewhere in a vault in Missouri there is a stack of school tablets with a 9-month-old boy in them, and he is not lost because she wrote him down. You can let the day go now. It kept what mattered. Good night.